Here we go. All right, so welcome to episode 2. I'm Erin Courtney. This is Andrew Stavranos, and we are officially changing the name of our podcast. So we had one podcast called Stated Simply, and the idea was we were going to state complex problems in a simple way, but that involved a lot of teaching and trying to be like a master of a subject. We felt too restricted to books, too restricted to almost curriculum. So instead of trying to be masters, we realized we're both on journeys of becoming experts.
Right.
So we're each trying to become an expert in our own field. I'm going to school to pursue my PhD in developmental psychology.
I'm going to school for mechanical engineering. I want to design and make things that help move the world in the way that I see it, and that is to be determined on what exactly I'm going to be doing. But that's the whole thing. That's why we read books. That's why we're going to school. We want to incorporate all these complex things into the world and try to figure out society, try to figure out how all these things overlap and come together to make this crazy world we live in.
But so we're each on a journey to become an expert, and we both want to talk about these polarizing topics. Today, we're going to be talking about race. We're going to be talking about social inequality and injustice. And these are really easy conversations to avoid when you don't know much about it.
Yeah.
They're really easy conversations to have your opinion influenced by emotional ploys when you don't know much about it. So in order to be an effective voter, an effective citizen, an effective human being, we need to pursue becoming an expert in any field that we feel is important.
Right.
And in looking at the ballot coming up and looking at the choices that we have to make, we both feel it's important to try to become an expert
Right.
on these social issues.
It's more than just want, it's a need. In order to improve society, in order to be a productive member in that society, you need to talk about these things. And for some reason, these are things that we can't talk about, or socially we're not supposed to talk about. But I think that's the opposite approach. We think that's the opposite approach. And that's why we're doing this podcast.
But so throughout our podcast, we're going to be at times narrating our own journeys as we become experts in our own separate fields. We're going to be doing our own personal research into topics that we want to talk about and want to explore. And then we're going to be inviting people on who we want to learn from so they can show us their mastery of a topic and help us and help you become experts in their relevant fields. I'm really excited about this new direction, really excited about the change. And it's really interesting because whenever you start a new project, whenever you start something that you're passionate about, you start off with an idea that is just supposed to get you in the room. You know, It's supposed to get you on the racetrack, and you have no idea where it's going. You have to tinker around a little bit. We tried this another episode, was it last week?
Yep.
And it went horribly because we were trying to teach about things that we didn't quite know yet.
We were pretending to be PhD professors.
Exactly. And we're just not there. We're becoming experts. And so we're at this place where our expertise is open to change, and we are open to new information, and we are abiding by the principle that democracy abides by and necessitates, and that we can change our mind when the facts change. So when George Floyd got killed, when Black Lives Matter started marching, when riots broke out, I had one opinion based on the information that was presented to me by the media. Right. I was by no means an expert. And here we're using expert just as simple as you've done your own research, you've read long form, you know more than what's being presented to you, and you don't repeat the phrases that are commonly chanted.
Right.
So by becoming more of an expert in this world of racial inequality, in this world of Black Lives Matter, my opinion has changed multiple times. I've come to view it from a much higher perspective, from a bird's eye view, and
our perspective of there is a racial inequality in the United States. There is a socioeconomic gap that's affecting negative circumstances in everyone. That is a fact. But it's how we look at it, how we deal with it, and how we talk about it that actually creates reasonable change. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going to try to communicate right now.
And how we view the political and media reactions to these happenings that has changed in response to our own education.
Right.
But so housekeeping out of the way, still took us quite a bit of time, but that's
how it goes
part of the game.
Yep.
Yeah. So where all of this started, where this really began in 2020 was the death of George Floyd.
Right.
He got choked essentially by a kneeling police officer for 8 minutes and 24 seconds and died. And everyone viewed this and immediately assumed it was a racial issue.
Right.
There was little forethought, little examination. It was a racial issue that necessitated rioting, that necessitated violence, that necessitated civil upheaval.
It was presented to us that this only happened because the police officer was white and George Floyd was black. That was the underlining basis for what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly that's not true. It's not at all. You could replace George Floyd with someone from any different ethnicity or race, and the same outcome could have happened. And there's countless examples of that happening.
Tony Timpa is my favorite one to use because he is white and he got sat on for a similar amount of time, and the police officers were very casual about the whole thing. They didn't think they were becoming murderers.
Right.
And he ended up dying. And there was no racial difference between the officer and the victim, and it wasn't racially charged, and it didn't get any attention because the guy wasn't black, frankly. And it's hard for me to look on and wonder, why aren't people talking about these other instances? Why are they so ready to jump on this racial boat?
Right.
Now, go ahead.
And there's a lot of manipulations at play, and there's a lot of truth in the fact that there is racial disparities with economic status, with people being imprisoned, with sentencing. That is true, and that is there. And so I see the emotional motivation to pigeonhole it on that. But that's not how a civil, intelligent, rational society deals with problems, where we find a problem and then associate every single issue with that problem. And so the deeper we looked into this, the deeper that we found, the more that we found out that this isn't just a racially motivated thing. And by categorizing it as that and repeating it over and over and over again, we've created this mob that is motivated by manipulations that is leading us in an area that we don't see is healthy or safe for our country or for the world, for that matter.
And when George Floyd died, suddenly these news organizations started pulling out statistics, started manipulating statistics to help prove their point that there is severe racial activity and racial inequalities in confrontation with police officers. Suddenly, police officers became the enemy and were essentialized as police officers. They became identified as police officers and as their own group that needed stopping, that needed defunding, that needed some sort of radical change. And all of this was built around the idea that police officers kill more black men than white men on an annual basis, at least in proportion. The statistics that were commonly thrown around was that black men are 3 times more likely to be killed by a cop than white men. And this is a true statistic. They are 3 times more likely. But the way it was presented is that they're overrepresented in deaths by police officers. They didn't talk about how overrepresented black men are in violent crimes. Right. Because although they're 3 times more likely to be killed by a police officer, they are, I think it's 6 times more likely to be a violent offender, a violent criminal.
Right. And also when you look at what is the most lethal force against black people, it is black people. Mm-hmm. The most deaths to black people are from another black person. It's 10 times the amount of deaths from cops happen from other black people. And there's so many issues underlining why that is the reason. And I think a lot of them can and are systematic to the way our structures are set up, but that does not mean that every single police officer is by nature a racist, which is what is being portrayed. These police officers are sacrificing their lives for us a lot of the times. I mean, we just had a police officer get shot and killed like 3 months ago in our county, and that man had a family. That man was a mentor to a lot of people, and he devoted his life to the police force and protecting our society, which is so much more of the case than not. And, I do believe that the police officer that killed George Floyd, I do believe he has big time issues, and he isn't qualified to be a police officer. And though these are some issues that are slightly being talked about, but in my opinion, aren't being focused on, where we need more training to police officers. We need yearly or biannually mental checkups, bias checkups, like all these, the training needs to increase in our police force, which is why when we hear defund the police and take away this established institution that protects us, it just seems nonsensical to me when you play it out over, a million iterations of a million different situations. And yeah.
Well, when people scream defund the police, when people try to point to the police as the enemy, they're ignoring the fact that on a yearly basis, there are around 11,000 murders. Right. Around 6,000 of them are black men being killed by black men. Right. And the inner cities where these crimes are happening need protection. They need an outsource of people who can come in and solve crimes, prevent crimes. But
And this is why when we're creating a Black Lives Matter movement and we need to talk about actual solutions, a solution isn't creating a riot that's burning down businesses. What we need is government action and funding to put money into these places where 75% of black men are growing up without fathers, and we need to rebuild these cities and then employ the people who live there to build them up. We need to create solutions like that creates this like long-term change, to not put a Band-Aid on the problem, not shout out all the problems, but give solutions. And I don't see a lot of solution mentioning being brought up. I just see a lot of problems being yelled at and retribution demanded for, which is a dangerous and slippery slope, because it starts with George Floyd, which I was outraged, and like anyone should be seeing that. But then when I see people's family businesses being burned to the ground by people who think that they are doing something good, that's where we go down a bad slippery slope. And then who's the arbitrator, and then there's the virtue signaling, and it quickly goes downhill if we can't be civil, we can't have conversations and not sensationalize everything into this is purely a problem of race.
And that's not to say that there isn't a problem of race, right?
Yeah, we know there is. Of course there is. But this isn't a way about coming to a solution, in my opinion.
No. What is highly popularized are these videos of rioters, videos of people creating violence, people protesting, people with signs out in the street, trying to make their voice heard, trying to make a difference. What we're seeing on the other side of this racial dichotomy for white people who want to make a difference, they're reading books like Me and My White Privilege. They're reading books that are essentially teaching them how to think about their own white supremacy, in air quotes, and how to undo that thinking. And they're furthering the racial divide. These ideas of, I'm actually more racist than I think, and I've benefited from this my entire life. These solutions that people are offering aren't solutions. They're furthering the divide between the races. If you want to talk about solutions, we can start talking about bolstering the police force with better training. We can start talking about adding psychologists, adding social workers to people who can respond to emergency calls. We can start talking about injecting education into poorly funded education systems and injecting finances, getting those finances from property taxes of local businesses or businesses across the state, because right now schools are strictly funded from local property taxes, not strictly, but for the most part. We can start talking about ending the damn drug war that was partially started to dismantle Black power structures in the Black Panther movement during the rebellion against the Vietnam War. But this war on drugs is what creates the violence in these inner cities. It's these people that find some possible way to get fed, find some possible way to make money through the selling of drugs. And then they need to be able to protect themselves because they can't call the police to protect their enterprise. So if we decriminalize the war on drugs, how much of these murders would go away? How much interaction with the police officers would go away? There are 10 million interactions with police officers and violent criminals every year, and there are 1,000 deaths by police officers. So if we decrease the interaction, we decrease the amount of deaths because it's strictly a matter of proportionality here.
Right.
And so,
and that's a way of talking about, okay, there is a source of systematic racism within our policy, right? The war on drugs, where just by having a little bit of crack compared to a little bit of cocaine, you are going to get 10 times as bad of a sentence, knowing that the Black population uses crack and the white population primarily uses cocaine. Right there, that's an issue. And I know that is being talked about, but it's not a driving force. And like what you said about white fragility, as a white person, the first thing that I did when I saw the Black Lives Matter movement come up and I saw this, I was like, wow, like, do I have these implicit biases that I don't know about? Okay, now I need to go read, I need to go learn, and I need to go figure out what they are so I can mend them. And the problem is the things, the books, the information that's being told to us to solve the problem is using race as the main driving force for the solution. And we know from reading books like Behave that race is really a weak type of in-group, out-group ideology or thought. And we need to take race out of the equation. We need to stop creating this Black group, this white group, this brown group, whatever, and start associating each other with our similarities and treating each other as the same. Because although we have a different color skin, does not take away the fact that we are all human beings. And so to drive race down people's throats is asking to make race a more and more and more of a issue, of a point of contention. And that's what we want to avoid. Sam Harris had a really good little thing on his podcast where he said, when you walk in a room, you don't, instantly bias people off, oh, there's 4 redheads, there's 5 brunettes and 3 blondes, because you don't even think about it. It doesn't matter. And that's what we need to do with race, where that doesn't matter. At no point do we need to be thinking about that in as a similarity difference between us and another individual. And unfortunately, a lot of the tools being used to try to correct the problem are really, in my opinion, driving us to more contention, more problem.
It's abiding by identity politics and making race an essential part of someone's identity, making them have to operate based on their racial orientation. That's funny. Based on the color of their skin, though.
Right.
And instead of, like you're saying, furthering the divide between people, we need to start finding ways to find commonalities, to work together, to solve complex problems, find ways to orchestrate cooperation rather than separation.
Right.
So I think it's important to touch on, but in social identity theory and what it's been found over and over again in studies is the idea of in-group, out-group bias. So us, them bias, meaning if you associate yourself with a group based on some arbitrary characteristic, you will favor them over people without that characteristic. So you will give them more positive adjectives, more positive associations, and you'll give negative, disgust, fear.
You'll be less likely to stay mad at someone if they're within your group. You'll be more likely to give rationalizations on why an outgroup member would be more wrong than they really are.
Exactly. And all of this happens very fast. Subliminal, like it's so
40
fast.
Milliseconds before you could think.
It's called an implicit bias. And this has been proven time and again where people of a certain race are going to be implicitly biased towards their own race. Unless you're a kid who's been adopted under the age of 8, then you're going to be implicitly biased towards your parents' race, which is pretty trippy to think about.
Yeah.
But so this bias isn't going anywhere. Like this isn't something that we can eliminate. We can't eliminate this implicit association with you and the group you're associated with is as good. But what we can do is examine it, bring that to our own awareness.
And not hold that value of a racial group being important. The more important you make each racial group, the more in-group, out-group type of behavior you're going to get.
The funny thing is what they found was if someone was exposed to a counter stereotype, so everybody knows Oprah Winfrey. Everybody seems to love Oprah Winfrey. She just kills it on all fronts.
Right.
If someone is told to think about Oprah Winfrey, think about their feelings towards Oprah Winfrey, that's hard to say after a while, their implicit bias goes down. It reduces significantly. And so just exposure to counter stereotypes, thinking about counter stereotypes, reduces implicit bias. It would reduce, if it reduces implicit bias, it has to reduce explicit bias, right? From there, just making implicit biases known will make people make choices and at least think beyond those subconscious levels of thought. So this is all happening in your limbic system. It's happening quick. But if you give somebody the opportunity to think about it from their cortical regions, the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, areas where you can actually choose the way you behave instead of just react. If you give someone that opportunity, that length of time, then they don't act on their implicit bias.
Right.
If they're exposed to their implicit biases.
And what we're seeing is so much cognitive clutter on the racial biases and the racial issues that it's making it harder and harder and harder for people to use their cortical regions to do that. And there's been plenty of studies on it that shows when you increase someone's cognitive load before they do an implicit bias test, they're going to do worse on the test. And so that's what's happening. We're being flooded with repetition and repetition of the importance of the racial differences, that they are ubiquitous in our head, and we can't get away from them, which is what we need to do. Like what it demands to happen, what it needs to happen.
What another aspect is in this talk about thems and us's, blacks and whites, we are encouraged to essentialize that race group. So we're encouraged to say, oh, all black people are experiencing worse interactions with police officers. They're experiencing racial inequalities at institutions. You know, they view the world X, Y, and Z way, and white people are getting it this way, that way. We're essentializing a group based on some sort of feature, whether it's the color of their skin, whether it's how they were raised, whether it's the income in their parents' household. But
their ideology.
Anytime you increase or encourage essentialism or essentializing, you're increasing the us-them bias. You're increasing the gap between the out-group and the in-group. And what they've shown is that if you, instead of essentialize, individualize, and you start thinking about one person in that group, you start thinking about this out-group member as a person, you try to empathize with them, that bias goes away. There's an awesome study, which is a really weird one, that shows, like, so they have people looking at pictures of either people in their group or outside of their group. So they have, let's say they have a white person looking at pictures of either white people or black people. And they're asked to estimate their age, and they're in a brain scanner. And anytime you view somebody from an outgroup, your amygdala, this part of your brain that is responsible for fear, for anger, for aggression, is activated. And if they were asked to guess how old they were, that activation increased because they're trying to judge them as an outsider even more. But if that person was holding a vegetable and they were asked, do you think this person likes the vegetable? There was actually zero amygdala activation. And some people might hear, oh, well, I guess just vegetables make things go away. Vegetables are good on so many fronts. But
that's what I thought originally.
That's not the case. I wasn't going to say that. But that's not the case. What's happening is these people are trying to empathize with the person in the picture, figure out what emotion they're feeling as they're looking at this vegetable, and decide what their taste is. And so all of these are requiring them to think of the person as an individual, not destined to their race, the clothes they're wearing, the upbringing they had. And their amygdala was not activated at all, which means thinking of them as an individual made them an in-group.
Right.
And so this essentializing that's happening across the media is furthering the gap. It's making it so much worse. And we're all complicit in it by watching it, by consuming it, by repeating it.
And not to mention, it's taking away which is what you're saying, it's taking away the agency of the person within the group that you're sensationalizing. And when you say, oh, the black culture or all blacks are X, Y, and Z, then you're saying that each black is the same. You're flattening the curve on their abilities, on their personality, on everything that distinguishes them as an individual. And like, to me, that's so disheartening to see, because every single person brings their own value, their own unique touch to the world. And when we just in this group think, we're taking that away, and it's sad to see.
It's hard to watch.
Yeah.
It's hard to participate in.
Exactly.
But what we're seeing is people who are equally outraged at this idea, or at the idea of the racial inequality, and are only given a bit of information. I love the quote. I don't know who it's by, but that a bit of information is the most dangerous thing. Like, a small amount of information is the most dangerous thing, because people think they know all of a sudden.
Right.
But people are taking the information that there's racial inequality, and there is systematic imprisonment of black men that are essentially slaves in jails doing work for 25 cents a day, I believe is the current. I don't know if that's the current prison rate, but that's what it was last time I checked. Right. There's underrepresentation on so many fronts based on cultural differences, based on essentially reactions to being rejected from society. So it's typical in a black inner city for someone to be considered an Uncle Tom, or considered to be trying to be white for trying to get educated. And that's strictly a response to the fact that they were denied from education systems for so long. So they had to redefine themselves.
Right.
Not inferior groups, but groups that were persecuted, groups that were rejected have to claim their own identity in order to empower themselves. So they have to redefine why things are the way they are. So rather than saying, oh, we're victim to this educational rejection, it was important for them to say, we don't want to be educated.
Yeah.
But anyway, these cultural artifacts are partly responsible for this underrepresentation in educational systems. They're partly responsible for the amount of black men committing violent crimes, because they are not given any other opportunities. And it's not that the black men are responsible for their culture. This culture is being forced upon them by so many outside perspectives, by so many outside forces, like the media, hip hop, TV, social media. I mean, it's reading, teaching inside of schools. It's not being taught well enough, so that so many people in inner cities are forced to get their information from video clips. They're not able to read long form articles. And this sounds like I'm super essentializing, but it's not based on a person. It's based on the education that they're being exposed to.
Yeah. And these systems are remnants from a very racially skewed system in the past. Mm-hmm. And the way that our political system works, it is slow and it does take time. But, just like how there was segregation, there was slavery, those things mend and they change. And just like there was, gender differences in the types of jobs you could have and all that stuff that are still problems, but they are amending themselves and we are pushing in the right direction. But yes, they are still a problem. And yes, there needs to be an acceleration in the change for these. And I agree with that. But the way in which we accelerate this is not by like all the things that we were just saying about it, sensationalizing the problem and saying it's just one thing. And in order for us to really do that, like I said, we need to come together and have an open circle of talk, not kind of like how the Black Lives Matter is doing it, where, hey, if you're white, you just need to shut up and listen. And we need to voice all of our anguish and our problems, and then you need to abide by our solutions. That's not how we're gonna come to a real time solution. And it's incremental in our change, which isn't fast enough. But at the same time, we could go backwards really quick.
We are going backwards.
And so when I see in California Prop 16, where they're trying to bring back affirmative action, I just, what I see is we're emboldening this racial group thought, this gender identity, this racial identity. And then what I think of is, who's the arbiter to say what you really are, you know? Because let's take gender, for example. You know, the way that we come to see it right now is that, you know, gender is fluid in a lot of ways. And I think that's right. I think that I think gender is a dichotomy biologically, but the way you express your sexuality is totally fluid, and that's okay. But when you say we're going to hire and employ people based on that, well, who's determining what level you are in this whole spectrum of possibilities, right? And going back to the whole in-group, out-group, it's creating in-groups and out-groups that are that are setting people up to be at odds with each other.
It's creating more categories that have sharper borders, sharper boundaries without crossover.
Exactly. And so it honestly is scary to me when I see that.
I forget if it's at Brown University or Princeton University, but it's a college on the East Coast that is saying that professors or assistant professors who are hired, who are of color.
I think it's all Ivy League schools.
Oh, really?
I think so.
But so these professors of color who are hired are going to be getting an extra semester of
furlough.
Not furlough.
Where they get time off.
Yeah, what is that called? Sabbatical. They're getting an extra semester of sabbatical in their first 4 years because of the burden of mentor relationships with students of color and the racial inequalities they're getting at these schools. And so this doesn't sound like a bad thing on surface, but what you're realizing is they're making an assumption based on the color of someone's skin that they're going to need to give more work to mentor relationships with students who are of the same color. So it's on the surface, it's trying to establish equality, but they're making so many assumptions that are not based on fact, that are just based on just so stories based on the color of their skin. It is by definition a racist law.
Right.
And
imagine that imagine that in business. Oh, because you're in the same position as someone else from any other race, but you're at the same position, but you're black, and there's a whole bunch of other races. But because you're black, you get an extra 20% bonus because of all the hardships of being black in the United States. And well, that is in the name of equality. What it's going to do to everyone else that works there is takes away the egalitarian, the equal opportunity for a similar outcome.
And it increases resentment.
Exactly. And so in the process of trying to force equality down each other's throats, we're creating more of a me versus you type of atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And when you start giving people preference points based on their race, what type of message is that sending to everyone? It's really shocking. Yeah. And when you play that out over 20, 30, 40 years, are we really working to get the best possible outcome, or are we willing to accept a poor product? In this case, product could be anything, in the name of vindicating past injustices.
Well, along those lines, colleges are, I mean, there's been talk of changing STEM, changing science and mathematical
Technology,
approaches, engineering,
and mathematics.
but there's been talk of reducing the mathematical requirements to become a rocket scientist.
Right.
Like they're trying to say that being black means you don't have to abide by the same standards as other people. And do you not hear how racist that sounds? Like
it's
like
insane.
Oh, so since you're black, we're going to have lower expectations. Like that is the definition of racism. Is it not?
It is.
It's assuming inferiority based on the color of your skin.
Right. And I'm not saying that this is fair, but it's something that needs to happen, where just because something horrible and bad and just it shouldn't have happened does not mean you use that same tactic to vindicate yourself or to regain your power leverage. Mm-mm. It just perpetuates the problem, and we're going this cycle, and it's just going to constantly be turning, and we're just going to be going around and around and around.
The problem is that young black people right now are being taught to identify with their victimhood based on the color of their skin. They're being taught to expect to be treated worse based on the color of their skin, and use that victimization as a bolster to their own identity and say, oh, this is part of what makes me who I am, that I'm a victim of the color of my skin. They're being taught to have self-disdain, self-hatred, and general malaise about the color of their skin. It's
just go watch a David Goggins video and get that shit out of your head. Just kidding. But no, seriously, it's insane. And, you know, I think one of the biggest things of growing up and why college is so good and why that transition period of adolescence to adulthood, so much of it is learning to not be a victim and to take responsibility for yourself and not rationalize what is not in front of you because of your victimhood, and learning how to make a plan and fulfill it. And I know right now that it's not equal for everyone, but that is what we need to work on, and we need to work on it by not going backwards, which is what's happening.
Well, back to what you're saying about David Goggins and just having mental state, it made me think of the fact that Nigerian immigrants are disproportionately successful compared to other immigrants and local black population. So they will succeed in education, succeed in business at a much higher rate than they are expected to. And that's because they're coming from an outside culture. They're coming without growing up thinking all these things associated with being a black American. And that has nothing to do with the fact that they're black. Like, they're not being treated differently because they're black. They're coming in with a different mentality, and they're able to navigate the United States world successfully because it's not hammered into them based on their culture. To me, there are so many things wrong, right? The education system's wrong. We've been over it a bunch, but I think the bottom line is the culture needs to change, both from the outside and from the inside.
I think it's Princeton who's getting sued by by foreign and American Asians because now they are doing too good that they were overly represented in the college because they are clearly more academically focused, and, you know, rightfully so. And now they are racially being biased and systematically being picked over purely because they're too good.
Uh-huh.
And, like, there you go. And it's like, where does that stop?
I think it was Harvard.
It was Harvard.
Yeah.
And I just read, I think it's Princeton too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And, you know, these are the top institutions in the country, in the world. And to say that we are going to not accept the best of the best is absolutely insane to me. And going back to the STEM, which is such a cool thing that I see where I'm going to school, is that I swear to God, there is probably 50% of all students are Latinos. And it's such an empowering thing to see all this whole demographic uplifting themselves through STEM. And it is happening. But to then have the Black Lives Matter movement and some of these critical race theory people shout out that we need to take away STEM because it's unfair and it's racist, you're taking away future opportunities for people. And
Well, so another finding showed that when Black students were let into STEM programs of these Ivy League schools, because of affirmative action, that they performed rather poorly. That I believe it was 50% of the incoming students either changed their major or dropped out,
right,
compared to, I believe it was 3%
after they got $50,000 in debt, attempting it.
But and this appeared on the surface to be a factor of race. But when you sorted this information differently, you sorted it in terms of previous educational experience, then it took race completely out of the picture. So what that means is that this educational success is dependent on previous educational experience. And so it's not a matter of lowering the standards of these Ivy League schools or colleges in general. It's a matter of raising the standards of schools at a lower level in these places where a higher proportion of Black students go, or other underrepresented races.
And that's where it goes back to, like, hey, this isn't a race issue. It's a socioeconomic standard issue. It's hey, we need to give young people proper environments to develop. We need to increase schooling for everyone and our focus on it. We need to do every single one of these areas you can talk about outside of race.
Yeah.
And it helps everyone. And so it's...
Well, and like you're saying, so the best way to talk about it outside of race, it's kind of still talking about it in terms of race, but race is just out of the question, is through socioeconomic status, is through looking at the gaps like you're talking about, looking at the difference from the bottom to the top, and how socioeconomic status is literally the standard for health grading. You can watch and go down each class of financial income and watch health status just drop dramatically on every single step, as well as education status, as well as,
and it's not due to healthcare. They've looked at where there's places where universal healthcare, where they have all the same healthcare, and it is totally outside of the ability to get healthcare. And when you talk about pollution and other environmental effects, that only attributes to about 1/3.
Nice.
And so it really is about the development and environment, the social environment in the development as an adolescent.
It's mostly comes down to whether someone feels poor, which is the trippy part. It's the amount that people without are exposed to the people who have. So, and it's also a huge function. So inequality, as inequality increases, the gradient of the socioeconomic status, so the slope that goes from those with the most health to those with the least health, increases as inequality increases. But more than that, as social capital decreases. Social capital is the amount you think you can affect change on your society, the amount you trust the other people in your society. As inequality increases, social capital decreases. So people no longer trust their surroundings. They no longer trust the people in their society. Obviously, you're no longer going to be trusting the police or the teachers.
Exactly. It's a trickle-down effect of everything.
All of this has a direct impact on health, on education, and obviously on the potential of one's future.
Right. And you know, that's going back to the actual problems at hand. That's why when you see 75% of young Black kids and men are living life without a father, and they don't have, and a lot of that has to do with the war on drugs, where a lot of those fathers were imprisoned and killed. And then you see, oh, okay, where do these kids go? Then they go to gangs because they find a group that they're included in. And like, that's why these are the issues at hand. And
they're just given no role models. They're given no way to access information because they're not taught how to read in their school. They're given no potential source for income or for stability because they don't have it at home already. They need to create it or contribute to it. And the only viable means, because we have a very well justified law against child labor, but the only way they're able to do it is through illegal means, because kids who come from low socioeconomic status without financial income at home need to create that income. So they need to go to work at such a young age.
They're in survival mode.
Exactly.
They don't get the opportunity to explore social games with friends, with complex ideas. They don't get to play around with math equations. You know why? Because they're focused on, how do I get food on the table? Is my mom going to be able to come home, or is she working her double shift and working all through the night? Like, and it's, oh my.
Here's the double-edged sword that I see, is because
Yeah.
being poor doesn't excuse being a criminal. Right. So it's not just like, oh, well, they're poor, so we can justify the fact that they murder a bunch, and we can justify the fact that there's a lot of violent crimes, because there are plenty of poor places that don't do that.
Right.
You know, there, you can look at the, what would it be? I don't want to call it illegal immigrants because that sounds wrong. But basically foreign workers who aren't citizens, they are banding together as families to work under the table to create the income that they need to exit poverty.
Right.
And so, there's a cultural change, cultural difference there that can be clearly seen. So it's not just a matter of like, oh, well, they're poor and that takes care of it, but it's that they're poor. There's a specific culture surrounding what's going on, and there are specific laws and ways to make money that they have access to. In California, there are places to make money that are outside of drugs, right? You can go into the agricultural world. You can go into, like, there's plenty of other places to kind of under the table make money.
Right. And okay, so talking about this is related, but going back to some of the things mentioned in the proponents of critical race theory, and a lot of what I'm hearing through Black Lives Matter movement leaders is this idea of like retribution and being able to basically pay people based off the severity of their slavery ancestry. So, have you not heard this?
I've heard this. Yeah. I'm just me going, yeah, that sounds
okay. and this is one of those things where it's a complex idea, and if what's really creating this huge generational gap in wealth is there is so much more businesses owned by non-Black families, and their money is in a sense liquid. Their consumer money. They're not producing money in the long term. And so if you give them this retribution and they spend it without putting it into and creating businesses, it's just perpetuating the system that's already at play, and it's going to create a bigger
reparation. There we go. You're saying retribution.
Yeah, retribution.
I was like, why is this not ringing a bell? Okay, reparation.
Sorry about that. Yeah, but it's perpetuating the system already at hand. But something that might not, it's not affirmative action, but it is incentive based of saying, hey, we want to promote Black businesses in Black neighborhoods by policy in a way that is promoting the production of good business. Now we can start creating long-term generational wealth within Black families. And that's why when you see people like LeBron James and all these big athletes that are putting money into things like that, that's what we need. And it needs to be the long-term play. You can't change the problem.
No, injecting money.
Exactly. We need to be just like when we say how are we going to fix global warming in the environment, we need to be thinking 50, 100, 150 years in the future. How are we going to make long-term change that is going to get us to a place where there really is no difference in race? And we do that by implementing policy like that promotes Black businesses, not giving money through reparations that just plays into the system at hand. That's already
just gets spent.
Exactly.
I mean, we saw it happen with the stimulus checks.
Yeah.
Nobody saved that. It was immediately spent.
Yep.
But yeah, so I haven't heard this idea of creating essentially policy changes for promoting Black businesses in Black neighborhoods, but I think that's fantastic. I think another thing I thought of while you were talking about is making trusts for education, the same way that families, like when somebody dies, they can make a trust that gives the money to a grandkid or to a kid if they go to college. It will act as their payment for college. And so if we could create trusts that were only accessible while going to school for school, then this would also create a big long-term shift. It would change the culture, and people would be more open to this education program, and they would be more motivated as a kid to say, "Oh, I need to get into college, so I'm going to study now." Like I feel like that would inject a cultural shift.
Yeah. And so this is an like school is a topic that I battle with because in my head, why do I have to pay $40,000 to go to a university? Or why do you have to put yourself in debt just to get an education? And then to people who don't even have the means to do that, let's say you take out federal loans and you say, oh, well, you could take privatized loans. Well, if you come up from a poor background, the chances of you having good enough credit to even get these loans are so low. And so it's skewed there again. And I say, why as a country isn't it a right as a human being to get education and to be free? But then when you look at it, you say, well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of issues with that, a lot of issues. But this is a topic and it's something that what I want our congressmen to be talking about and battling, right? And a little bit going away from like the problems with race in looking at our system. You know, unfortunately, I feel like we're in a system to where there's two polar opposite parties that their goal isn't providing a better life for its citizens. It's honestly perpetuating the interests that support their systems. And what they want to do is take power away from the other party and give it to their constituents. And because of that, so many important issues get overlooked or just give lip service to, and real problems aren't being deeply talked about and put into action. And it goes back to the systematic problems that we have and a lot of, honestly, identity politics and sensationalizing, which it's a symptom of what's happening with race too. And I know I'm getting a little off topic, but I think school's so important. And when we talk about what gives young people the best opportunity to have proper development, brain development, social development, it's through schools. It's taking them away from the problems at home and allowing them a safe place. And, it's unfortunate that the worst schools are in the worst areas when those are the schools that need the most help. And, and that's why I think a lot of these places that like, and I know this is going into a lot of other things, but we spend hundreds of billions of dollars on military and fighting foreign terrorists and whatnot. But imagine if we spent a quarter of that money on rebuilding infrastructure in places like Chicago, where there's way more deaths per year of American citizens due to poor and shitty environments than we get to people, organizations like ISIS and whatnot. And it's just we need to refocus our ideals as a nation, and what when we talk about like unalienable rights given at birth, like education is one of those, in my opinion.
Well, and I think it comes down to, you're talking about the split from Democrats and Republicans. You're talking about the split between conservatives and liberals. And typically conservatives are looking for how the government can protect the people, and liberals are looking for how the government can provide for the people.
Right.
And so there's this huge dichotomy between how taxes should be spent, whether it should be spent protecting or spent providing. Because I think the biggest debacle around education reform is based on where's that money going to come from? Is it going to come from to the taxpayer? Because right now we have Prop 15 on the bill in California that is saying we can increase the property taxes for businesses whose property is worth more than $3 million to their current value. So there are certain businesses that have buildings that have been purchased for back in the 70s.
20s, 50s.
And so their property taxes are really low, and our education funding comes the majority from property taxes. So this wouldn't affect residents. This wouldn't affect small businesses. This would affect businesses in buildings that are more than $3 million
Right.
as a property. And so that money, according to this bill, would then be dispersed first evenly. It was like $100 per student per year at schools. And then it would be dispersed in the ranking of which school has the most kids on the free lunch program. So it would be dispersed literally based on economic disparity.
Right.
The problem that I see with the bill, I'm still going to vote yes on it, but the problem is
get 30% of the money.
It's 40% of the money.
Okay.
60% goes to local government with the idea and the intention that each of these places will have to have different solutions to their problems. But the problem is there's plenty of corruption in these local governments. And so we don't know where that money is going to go. There needs to be some sort of supervising board. I'm still going to vote yes because I hope we can then inject this supervising board in a future bill. Right. But I think any type of step towards educational equality, towards improving the education system is the right step. Even if it's a slight misstep, it's something that can be corrected, and it's something that communicates to the congressman, this is important to us, important enough for us to say yes and risk a little bit.
Yeah. And I totally agree with that. And going on to like how policy is done, how congressmen and women talk to you, they sensationalize, and how our government talks to us about, let's say, terrorism. They sensationalize these terrorist organizations. And when you look at how many people that these terrorist organizations have compared to how big of a country we are, it's so small. And then if you look at how many deaths per year to American citizens, it's even smaller. But when you're talking about protecting, well, if 280 people a year are dying of U.S. citizens by other U.S. citizens in one city, then isn't that needing protection? Isn't that needing funding? Isn't that needing solutions? And so...
But the thing is, those people have been so ostracized as thems that they're not even seen as being part of the same group. Right. They're people that are like, when people in New Orleans got affected by Hurricane Katrina way back when, it was like those people weren't even viewed as Americans. They were just viewed as people in New Orleans, and like people who were in California, people in New York were like, didn't affect me. People in Chicago, there's several people who they can't identify with them at all. But somebody traveling into a foreign country who gets killed on a train, people can identify with that person because that person is nameless, faceless, colorless. Totally. They're just a traveling American citizen, and so that person is more readily in us than someone who is a criminal in an inner city. And so it's, again, this us-them dichotomization that it perpetuates this not wanting to look at the problem in our backyard.
Right. And okay, and I like that. And I think, you know, we've been going on this line for a while. And I think before we really wrap it up, I want to talk about another thing, which is the way that I see the Democratic left party and a lot of the politicians is it's really, there's a lot of emotion and anger and this demand to think exactly like they do and agree. And if you don't agree, then you are the enemy in a sense. And
they're a racist.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're applying this to Black Lives Matter, when you're applying it to...
But it's not even just about race. It's about your character as a person. Mm-hmm. If you don't believe in their policy, in their measure, in their idea of how they see the United States and they see the future, then you're part of the problem. You're part of their problem, which means that you're the enemy. And this right there, that is a horrible way to look at it, because the reason we have a two-party system is that we need people from different points of view, from navigating different principles on how to come to a solution, and then they meet in the middle to find this balance. And we aren't getting that balance anymore. And we're going back to the us, them. We're theming people if they don't jump on board on their ship. We're on a ship and we're throwing them overboard. They're literally making people walk off the plank and tying them to a rock to go down to the ocean. Like,
Well, and that's
keep on going down that
yeah. How far you can take that metaphor? They're literally tying an anchor to their foot.
Exactly. Yeah. And what's so upsetting is like, hey, I'm with you on these problems. I'm with you on what needs to change. But guess what? We live in a civil society with a democracy that has a system based off of enlightenment that and rationality that brings us to outcomes that are detached from emotion. Because when you make decisions that are embedded in pure emotion, you go so off course. And the highest people in office are so emotionally driven right now.
Well, it's what gets them votes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an outrage culture right now, right? It's the time to be offended. It's the time to be a victim. It's the time to get upset. And so obviously the person who is most upset is going to be getting most of the votes because people are spending as much time as possible online getting upset and sharing the things that they get upset about.
Yeah.
Okay, using this, earlier you talked about change happens incrementally, right? You talked about progress happens incrementally. Well, bad things happen incrementally as well. And right now we're at this stage, we're at a precipice of outrage incrementally increasing more and more. And what we saw with these riots, what we saw was that it was acceptable to create violence, to burn down buildings, to just cause complete uproar in society because someone of your race was unjustly killed. And this violence has incrementally increased. Now we're seeing as a response, so this violence happened on the left, right? You're talking about like Democrats, people who are...
and the right is very guilty in
well,
a lot of
other...
Yeah.
So on a parallel course, on the right, suddenly we have right extremists arming themselves and trying to kidnap government officials, trying to kidnap governors of states, Michigan and Virginia. And
we have Trump in speeches saying stand by, telling these groups not to not to say that this is wrong. This is not how we go about it. He's saying to stand down and stand by.
He didn't say stand die, he's down. He said stand back and stand by, which just means keep your guns ready, essentially.
Exactly.
But this is also the same man that during the 2016 candidacy, he was telling people to get the people who didn't agree out, get the dissenters out of the crowds, and the crowd would...
in his campaign rallies.
Yeah, would be chanting USA and trying to find people who weren't chanting USA and essentially get them out. It was a violent escalation. But what I'm saying is this is happening incrementally, and when we say yes in one circumstance, we say yes in all circumstances by condoning this rioting, which I can understand. I understand the rioting was a way for them to reclaim selfhood and to be able to say, we have power.
Right.
Even though you're seemingly taking it from us with your policing. We said yes to the violence. We sensationalized it, and nobody got arrested. There's plenty of people who could be identified on videos, and those people should have been punished. But since we didn't, we said, hey, in the right circumstance, violence is okay. And that can incrementally increase until we have militias, until we have people who have usurped the monopoly on violence that we've given to our government. And the government's best role is that they've monopolized violence. They're the only people who can legally use force to stop someone from doing something or to get somebody after they've done something. Nobody else is allowed to do that. And because of it, we can live in a civilized place where we feel safe and we feel like we can be protected as needed, provided for as needed. So it's these incremental increases that are the most problematic. And
when you stand by and say, oh, if you think you don't agree with it and you stand by and you don't say anything and you let it happen, you're contributing to it. And I know that sounds, I know that you're it's like you're guilty by association in a lot of ways. But, you know, when like Hitler came to power, there was a lot of people who didn't agree with what was going on. But at the same time, they thought, oh, this would never happen. This can't happen. You know, this won't happen. But guess what? It does. And so, like, that's why we're having this talk right now. And it's just, we need to open up dialogue and be able to talk about this stuff, you know? And, yeah, I totally agree with what you just said.
And I read this quote in a New York Times article. So New York Times is left-leaning for sure. Everybody knows this. But it's a quote from Trump, and it said, Biden will disarm law-abiding citizens. And he's using this to spread fear into people with guns, saying, like, watch out, they're coming for you. And he's saying, in quotes, at the same time, they'll have violence down your streets, and that's just fine. So literally using the fact that there was violence that was okay to further condone more violence.
Yep.
So it's like...
And why is he saying that? Because those are his constituents that he thinks will give him a vote.
Exactly.
All they care about is maintaining
Getting that
power.
vote.
They don't care about you. They don't care about making society better. They care about staying in power, and that's not okay. And that's why, we have very important decisions coming up, and that's, and I just really encourage everyone, really think for yourself, become an expert in what you care about and the things that bother you.
And right in line with that, don't abide by identity politics, right? Becoming an expert is, like Andrew's saying, thinking for yourself, determining your own values, and judging the world based on the facts that you have, that you've discovered, that you've read about or experienced for yourself. Because this identity politics is so pervasive. People are voting and thinking based on some sort of affiliation with an arbitrary aspect of themselves, whether that's gender affiliation, whether that's skin color affiliation, economic status, or the way that they think politically. And all of that really comes down to personality differences.
You're taking away your options. You're not thinking. You're I'm sorry to say, but you're dumbing yourself down. And it's a good way to go backwards in history, in society. And I think we should end it on that note. I really like it. And I want to start doing another thing where we kind of give out a book recommendation, maybe at the end of each podcast. Just some of the stuff that we're reading that really sparked some of our thinking and our ideas along the lines of what the conversation's about.
I like this idea. He didn't tell me about this at all, but I'm super on board.
Yeah, well, none of this stuff we talked about
That's
beforehand.
True.
We just ran with it, and
I love this idea though.
It's so much of what we just talked about. It's all the little things that are floating around in our head, and they don't really connect. But by talking critically and really trying to put things together with another person, we've been able to connect the dots a lot. Mm-hmm. And for me, I have a lot more clarity in some of my ideas after this talk. And I think books help that. And that's what they're there for. And they build worldviews to build knowledge, to learn from the past. And this book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century by Timothy Snyder. It's a really easy book. I read a chapter every day when I go to number 2 in the toilet, and it's that easy. But
I read 3 chapters on the toilet.
But some of I get the goosebumps when I read some of these chapters, and they're so short, but it's so important. And some of the chapters are investigate for yourself. Don't be a sheep. And just.
So the point of this book, it's heeding a warning based on the historical happenings of the 20th century. So what happened in World War I, what happened in World War II, what happened in other countries where somebody tyrannical essentially took over, and looking at the steps and foreshadows that happened.
And we've had it on both sides. We've had the fall of communism and the fall of fascism. And where not just the fall, where millions of people died on every side. We have Maoist China, we have Stalin in Russia, we have Hitler, the Nazis, and that all happened within a lifetime, people. Seriously, maybe a little bit outside of a lifetime when you talk about World War II and fascism, but communism and Stalin's government was in a lot of people's lifetimes, and we've had existential threats to all of humanity multiple times. And if you think that can't happen again, you're not thinking. And so, I highly encourage you to read this book. We'll post a link on our description section. And I want to thank you for becoming experts with us.
Yep. Till next time. we agreed a lot more than we will in the future, I think.
Yeah, but I think we're both on the same page with this.
Yes.
And the next talk that we're kicking around is talking about social media and the effects on society, on young kids, on manipulations, and I think there's a lot to work with. And so see you next time.
Thank you.